A Libert Seguros agora é Yellow. Tudo aquilo que já era bom continua igual. Excelência e proximidade permanecem como nossa essência. Porque não é uma mudança, é uma evolução. A Yellow está sempre em sintonia com você. É liberdade com segurança. A melhor experiência acessível a todos os clientes, iluminando cada passo da sua jornada. Deixe essa luz iluminar seu caminho. Yellow Seguradora. Seguro para viver livre. Consulte seu corretor.
It's More Money with leading economist Steve Moore. Now, here's your host, Steve Moore.
Welcome back, folks. This is the More Money Show on WABC Talk Radio. We are on the number one talk radio station in these United States. And the purpose of this show is to help you make more money. And there's nobody I can think of who is better at advising on that than my longtime friend, Rob Arnott, who is the CEO of Research Affiliates. He has over $100 billion under management and is super smart when it comes to making money. So, Rob, thanks for joining.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's get right down to it. We've had a good market, for the last few years. And I guess let's just get right down to it. I mean, is this going to live on? Does it matter who wins the election?
One thing that surprises a lot of people, and we've written a white paper on this, where we entitled Polarization Trumps Politics. And what we find is something very interesting, and that is the closeness of the election matters far more than who wins. Why would that be?
Yeah.
If you have a polarized electorate and both sides are terrified that the other side's going to win,
right?
Then what happens? Both sides go risk off because they're afraid. And as the election...
Wait, hold on. Would you say both sides do what?
Go risk off. They take risk off the table. They sell stocks, for instance. And the result is that as the election comes very close, typically within the last week before the election,
right,
the outcome becomes a little bit more evident. That is to say, the odds start to skew one way or the other.
Right, and that certainly happened.
What that means is that one side is no longer quite so afraid and starts to buy, and the other side is still terrified and they already sold. So what you wind up with is, in a polarized election, about 8 times out of 10, it's not 100%, about 8 times out of 10, stocks rally in that last week and continue rallying no matter who wins for 4 to 6 weeks after that. Typical rise is about 5% in 5 or 6 weeks. That's not bad.
So what happens? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I understand what you're saying, but then you sometimes do get surprises. We had a big surprise in 2016, right? Where, Trump was not, he was given about a 20% chance of winning, and he did win. And so then what happens when you get a shock like that?
Well, one side or the other is going to wind up being pleased and will be happily buying. So you usually do get a run-up. The one notable exception in the last quarter century was, of course, 2000. The market tanked because the election was undecided. And there's a risk of that again this time, but I don't think of it as a high risk. I think by the end of next week we'll know who won.
So just so I understand what you're saying, so if I'm a Democrat and Biden wins, you're saying I'm more likely to buy. If I'm a Republican and Trump wins, I'm more likely to buy. So people are buying stocks based on their political leanings?
Yeah. Not everybody, but enough people to move the market.
Right.
Now, it does make a difference who wins. What we find is that if it's a trifecta, if it's President, House, and Senate, and it's a Democratic trifecta, the rally stalls. The market kind of goes sideways for a few weeks instead of up. And if it's a Republican trifecta, on average, there's about an 8% rally. So trifectas matter. But if it's a divided government, you wind up, firstly, politically, you wind up with not a lot getting done, which is not a bad thing. And secondly, you wind up with that modest 5% rally. That's the average outcome. And I've actually played this in my personal portfolio over the years in other countries too. Taiwan has had some highly polarized elections, so has England. And in most countries, when it's a polarized election with an uncertain outcome, the markets rally in the days ahead of the election and in the first handful of weeks after. Now are these? Said, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, because this is fascinating. So you're talking about these sort of short-term effects. By the way, we're only 2 days from an election right now, so
exactly.
A lot of those effects have already been felt. But are you saying that these are these just temporary effects, or do they? In other words, is it just for say a few weeks after the election, then it washes out, or how does it play out?
This is a short-term effect, and basically what I'm saying is if you're worried about the market or the economy and thinking about selling, don't sell in a panic now.
Right.
Average out of your position, trim it in the weeks ahead. Don't be in a rush because stocks do generally, with 70 to 80% odds, do pretty well in the last week before an election and in the first 4 to 6 weeks after. It's fairly reliable.
And so you're saying like the day after the election might be a good time to buy stock, regardless of who wins. As long as we know who wins. Rob, we may not know who wins for a week or 10 days. Who knows?
We probably won't know for a few days unless it's really not very close. I mean, people on both sides are saying there's going to be a surprise. It's not going to be close. Well, that might be true, in which case we might know on Wednesday. More likely we'll know Friday or the following Monday. Slight chance it could take longer than that, like it did in 2020 or worse in 2000. But remember, 2000 was a razor's edge election, and I remember Wall Street Journal did a report where they looked at all of the ways to count hanging chads and all of that nonsense.
I remember that.
And they found that depending on how you counted it, in most ways of counting it, Bush won, and in some ways Gore won. And what was quite hilarious was the way that the Bush team wanted them counted. Gore would have won, and vice versa.
Well, that was that was like flipping two coins and them both landing on top of each other.
Exactly.
What about just generally? Let's put politics aside then, and talk about. Well, first of all, if Trump wins, because I think right now that's more likely than not, but anything could happen.
That is more likely than not.
So, my friends at the Wall Street Journal have been hyperventilating about his tariff policy. I was saying earlier on the show, and I would love your reaction to this. I said, well, I'm not a tariff guy either. You and I are both free traders. But on the other hand, if you can't just look at his tariffs in isolation, he's now talking about saying, okay, we'll raise money from tariffs, but we'll use that money to, say, reduce income taxes. And in that case,
I think it'd be very cool.
Yeah, me too. And so I was wondering, and I that was kind of my lecture today on the show earlier. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, any way that you tax consumption rather than income, it's actually better. Better for the economy. Money we don't spend, what are we doing with it? Maybe we're parking it in a bank, in which case it makes its way into the business community. Maybe we're investing it. Either way, it's investment in the nation's future. And why on earth would we want less of that? So tariffs, I'm not a fan of tariffs, but, everybody sees this in black and white. And I think a 5 or 10% across the board tariff would be a speed bump to discourage, to help avoid U.S.-based businesses going out of business because of a temporary blip in the currency exchange rates. and so it'll
So
slow
wait.
things down.
Time out, Rob. Time out.
Yeah.
Because this is an important point you're making. I want to make sure everybody understands. So you're saying, let's say you had a 10% across the board tariff. I'm just, who
And
knows
that's kind
where.
of high end of my comfort
Okay.
zone, but
Okay, let's say 5, 6, 7%. So
Yeah.
you're saying that would obviously at the margin encourage more domestic production and discourage imports. But then you said there would be a dollar adjustment. Explain that.
Economics has the concept of comparative advantage. If I'm better at producing one product, say investment management, and you're better at producing another product, radio show, then it's better off if I stick with what I'm good at and you stick with what you're good at. And the same thing holds true of nations. So if an emerging country without a lot of technology is good at producing manganese,
Sure.
and we're good at producing super chips, then it makes sense for us to do the latter and them to do the former. And where it gets a little tricky is, let's take China and the U.S. If China produces cars and sells them here, and we produce cars and sell them there, then we've got similar product. And if there's a 10% tariff, then Chinese companies undercutting U.S. companies and putting them out of business would be just a little bit harder.
Right.
Now, if the U.S. is not competitive, is not good at producing cars, as an example, then eventually the business should go over to them, and a 10% tariff won't discourage that or won't prevent that. It'll just slow it down a little. If we're good at producing cars, then why on earth would we want that capability to go away?
Okay, I'm talking to Rob Arnott, who is the CEO of Research Affiliates, one of the smartest guys I know about making money. Overall, what countries do you like right now?
I think the U.S. is the most expensive stock market in the world. So while I spoke a moment ago about in and around an election is not a good time to sell, what I would say is the U.S. is expensive, and so taking some of our gains and redeploying them in non-U.S. markets can be a very good idea.
And which ones do you like?
I don't really cherry pick them. If you look at the broad swath of non-U.S. developed economy markets, you've got Australia, New Zealand, you've got Japan, you've got Europe, Western Europe. For the most part, almost all of these are very cheap relative to the U.S. Now, is that
based on their PE ratios, or how are you?
Price to earnings ratios, dividend yields. The U.S. stock market's dividend yield is only 1.3%. That means in a static economy, you'd have to wait 70 years to get your money back if you relied on dividends.
Right.
In Europe, the yield is a ballpark of 3%. So that's not super cheap, but that's not bad. And in emerging markets, it's 4%. Again, not bad. And emerging markets are indeed growing still faster than the developed world. So broadly, I would say investing in emerging markets, investing in international markets makes sense. All over the world, value is really cheap relative to growth stocks. By value, I mean stocks trading at low PE ratios and high dividend yields. And so we think that on a 10-year basis, U.S. stocks are priced to give us 3 to 5%, non-U.S. stocks 8 to 10%, and non-U.S. value stock. If you get 14%, you double your money every 5 years. If you get 3 to 5%, it takes a lot.
It takes a lot longer. It's good. Just my wife and I have bought a lot of NVIDIA stock, and we've done really well on that. We bought a decent amount of Google stock. We've done pretty well with that. So we like the technology industries, but they're very pricey now. So
they
what do
are
you
very
think?
Pricey.
So do you?
My attitude on that would be really simple. Why don't you take out your initial investment and start playing with most money on the rest?
Okay, that's a great investment advice. Finally, okay, you're Donald Trump's economic advisor, and you are. I know you're not, but if you were, what would you tell him to do? What would be the most important if you were president? What would be the most important thing for our country to do to reclaim the strong economic growth that this country deserves?
Here's an interesting point. Deficit spending is not a good thing. Deficits matter, but deficits have two components: high spending and low taxes. The answer of the left is, well, let's raise the taxes. The answer on the right is, let's cut the spending. We've actually done studies where we find that the more a country spends, the slower its economic growth. We think that's the essential problem in Europe.
Yes.
And it's a huge relationship. It's a 70% correlation between the amount of government spends and the rate of macroeconomic growth. So the easiest way to speed up growth is slash government spending.
Who used to say
Congress, but that would be good.
Yeah. Who used to tell me that all the time before he died was Milton Friedman. I used to ask him, what's the most important thing to get economic growth? And he said, we got to cut government spending and get it out of the way. So, Rob, I think you echo one of the greatest economists who ever lived. That's Rob Arnott, who is the chairman of Research Affiliates. Rob, I hope you'll come on again sometime soon. We learned a lot from you.
Very happy to do it.
Thank you, Rob. And we will be right back for some final words on the More Money Show on WABC.